Good afternoon, and welcome to today's industry-presented webinar, Fueling the Extra Mile, the Science of the Endurance Athlete. A few housekeeping things before we get started. This is a voice-over IP webinar, meaning it's totally web-based. If you experience audio difficulties, or if the video begins to buffer, it's likely caused by the strength of your internet signal. If you are having issues, try logging off and logging back on. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question area within the GoToWebinar navigation, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If your question goes unanswered, we'll take additional questions from today's webinar and post answers as a blog on the ACSM website at a later date. We also encourage you to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter by using the hashtag ACSMwebinar and also the hashtag GSSI. Today's webinar is presented by Gatorade Sports Science Institute. Founded in 1985, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, or GSSI, is committed to helping athletes optimize their health and performance through research and education in hydration and nutrition science. GSSI scientists study the effects of nutrition on the human body before, during, and after exercise. For more than 2 decades, hundreds of amateur, elite, and professional athletes have participated in testing with GSSI and in studies with university research partners around the world. GSSI headquarter, mobile, and satellite laboratories and on-the-field testing enable GSSI to do leading research with the aim to provide athletes with advice and products that help their performance and achieve their goals. One continuing education credit, or CEC, courtesy of Gatorade Sports Science Institute, will be emailed to all participants after the webinar. You should receive the CEC email and a link to the recorded webinar within the next 1 to 2 days. There is no need to email ACSM asking about CEC credit. Today's webinar presenters are Lisa Heaton and Kelly Barnes of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. Lisa Heaton has worked in the sports nutrition realm for more than a decade and is a board-certified specialist in sports dietetics with interest in sports nutrition, recovery, hydration, and performance. Lisa was also the sports dietitian for the Chicago Bulls for the 2015-16 and 2016-2017 seasons. At GSSI, Lisa works with nutrition-related education and translation of research and supports GSSI's athlete engagement program through management of all elite athlete testing conducted in the GSSI laboratories in Barrington, Illinois. Kelly Barnes is a clinical exercise physiologist who leads the research program in GSSI's Barrington headquarters. Currently, she works with Chicago area athletes to provide them with sweat and cardiovascular fitness information, while also obtaining valuable sports science data and knowledge. Having spent many years working in the field for GSSI's athlete service program, Kelly serves as a conduit to bring elite athlete hydration and nutrition questions back to the lab and transfer the lab learnings to the field. Kelly is going to start us off with today's webinar, so it's with great pleasure that we present to you Kelly Barnes.
Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation now. So today, Lisa and I are going to talk about the importance of energy, hydration, and protein for athletes. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the specific needs for endurance athletes that they'll have during training and competing for prolonged periods. Like I said, all sports nutrition needs can be divided into 3 categories: energy, hydration, and structure. However, the energy and hydration needs of the endurance athlete are unique and should be addressed as such. I'm going to start with energy and give a brief overview of the energy needs for all athletes, and then the specifics for the endurance athlete. And the first point I want to make is that energy in the form of carbohydrate is essential when exercising for prolonged periods. So this study highlights how athletes that are fed carbohydrate, so those with the dark red lines in each of these graphs, versus those that did not have carbohydrate, actually have a longer time to exhaustion. And in this study, it was an entire hour longer, which was 33% longer than those athletes that didn't receive carbohydrate. And you can see in the first graph on the left, the blood glucose levels of those athletes that did not receive carbohydrate begin to drop around that 2 hour, maybe just after that 2 hour mark, and then they were unable to sustain much longer. once their blood glucose levels dropped. Another point of this study was to look and see if feeding carbohydrate helps retain muscle glycogen stores. And you can see on the graph on the far right that those athletes that were fed carbohydrate had no different muscle glycogen stores than those that had the placebo, though they were able to exercise for a longer period. So what these investigators concluded was that athletes are able to oxidize carbohydrate from different methods than just muscle glycogen, and that feeding carbohydrate during exercise will prolong the exercise or the time to exhaustion. Now, all humans, athletes and all humans can use energy in the form of fat or carbohydrate. Everyone, even the leanest athletes, have plenty of fat stores in their body, but it's the fuel for slower, usually less intense exercise. And carbohydrate stores are limited. So eating carbohydrates helps support and replenish the glycogen stores so you can keep training and competing at those higher intensities. However, like I said, there's finite amount of glucose or carbohydrate that can be stored in the body. And once those run out without replacement, athletes will be forced to slow down or to utilize fats or to stop exercise completely. Now we can measure fuel utilization in the lab. And in general, as exercise intensity increases, carbohydrate use for energy and carbohydrate use increases and fat use decreases, but you're almost always burning a mixture of both. This graph is just an illustration of the change in the pattern of fuel use as exercise intensity increases. The point at which fat utilization decreases and carbohydrate utilization increases will depend on many factors for the individual athlete. However, even those athletes that can hold on to higher fat utilization for higher exercise intensities will still be burning more carbohydrates as the exercise intensity increases and will still need replacement. Another interesting point about exercise intensity, this study looked at muscle glycogen depletion at different exercise intensities. So they looked at VO2 max and exercise intensities equivalent to VO2 max of about 31% all the way up to 150%. And as you can see at the lower exercise intensities, those that are higher on the graph and farther to the right, they can sustain exercise for significantly longer and sustain muscle glycogen for significantly longer than those that exercise at the higher intensities. But not only is exercise intensity important, but duration is important as well. And this is where the endurance athlete becomes unique. As exercise duration increases, muscle glycogen decreases sharply, with reliance mostly on blood glucose, like I mentioned in that first graph, and plasma-free fatty acids for energy. Therefore, energy intake in the form of carbohydrates for energy during exercise is critical for completion and performance. Now, there's chronic methods to manipulate the amount of carbohydrate that we can store within our muscles. And in this study, they looked at athletes that were fed high carbohydrate diets across days and weeks. And that's depicted in the red versus those that had low carbohydrate diets depicted in the blue. And you can see that those that consumed more carbohydrates had higher amounts of muscle glycogen and were able to exercise for longer than those that, especially those that consumed the low carbohydrate diet. And they found that there was a correlation between the beginning muscle glycogen status and the time to exhaustion. So consuming carbohydrate before exercise and making sure that the muscle stores are supplied is very important. Now, there are a few ways that we can absorb carbohydrate through our gut. Glucose is absorbed through the SGLT1 transporter. And that transporter can sustain a rate of about 1 gram of carbohydrate or glucose per minute or 60 grams per hour. And we recommend consuming carbohydrates like this, like glucose, because they are absorbed quickly. However, it doesn't mean that there isn't a place for the slower sugars like fructose. And because it has a separate transporter, the GLUT5 transporter, it can be transported in addition to the glucose. So glucose can be transported across at about 60 grams per hour, and you can add an additional 30 grams per hour of the fructose. And this combined type of carbohydrate is especially important for endurance athletes or those that will be training or competing for more than about 2 to 3 hours at a time. This is also why carbohydrate recommendations aren't based on body weight, but are standard amounts that are based on exercise duration. Now, talking about the limitations of those transporters, there were studies that looked at whether intake, the amount of carbohydrates you intake, if you can oxidize that same amount. So they use two different types of carbohydrate. One is a single source of glucose with the gray line in circles, and then the other was a multiple source of glucose and fructose with the black line in squares. And as you can see, as the intake rate goes to about 1 gram per minute of the single source, the gray, the oxidation rate plateaus. However, with the multiple source, you can get up to about 1.5 before it starts to plateau. And after that point, there's not much additional benefit, and there often tends to be GI discomfort. However, that's individual to the athlete. Some athletes are able to tolerate slightly more. So this is why we recommend that athletes practice their hydration and fueling strategies during their training sessions. Now, the blend of carbohydrate sources impacts the osmolality, or the concentration of the drink, and how efficiently it moves from the stomach to the intestines. Having the glucose-fructose multiple source blend results in a faster gastric emptying, which can reduce that sloshing feeling that some athletes get in their stomach during exercise. And not only does the the gastric emptying improve, but fluid delivery improves too with the multiple source of carbohydrate. And this study shows that multiple sources of glucose and fructose empty the gut, as seen in the last slide, which will result in fluid getting into the blood faster than the beverages with glucose alone, and almost as fast as water, which means that it's usable by the body quicker. Now, the probably more important thing for a lot of athletes is their performance. And this study showed that as a consequence of improved gut comfort, fluid delivery, and faster carbohydrate oxidation, the performance was improved. And the researchers found that the combined type of glucose and fructose versus glucose alone improved performance and power on the cycling test by about 8%, with an additional 11% improvement over the placebo. Now I'm going to pass the presentation over to Lisa to talk a little bit more specifics about the carbohydrate diet and needs for athletes.
All right, thanks, Kelly. So looking at overall diet, Kelly's talked about glycogen storage, but we also want to look at potential to actually oxidize carbohydrate during exercise. And so in this particular study, they split the subjects into two groups, and for 28 days, one group followed a low carbohydrate diet of 5 gram per kilogram body weight, and the other group followed what was called a high carbohydrate diet, 6.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight, which in reality is not a huge variance when we look at the overall amount that we may recommend for an endurance athlete, but that is how they categorize these diets. And they had them follow this for 28 days. And they found at the end that the group that consumed the high carbohydrate diet did have a greater exogenous carbohydrate oxidation during exercise than the low, likely due to improved absorption. They're saying it's likely due to that carb absorption because the muscle GLUT4 that would take up, or GLUT4 that would take up the carbohydrate wasn't different, but they didn't actually measure those intestinal transporters. But there is some evidence in animal studies that you can upregulate the GLUT5 transporter in the intestines. So they are stating that they improve that exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, likely due to the improved absorption of carbohydrate during exercise. So this is an example of how overall diet can have an impact on fuel utilization during exercise. So what I wanted to do now was go through basics of the recommendations that we find in the joint position statement from the American College of Sports Medicine and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that was published in 2016. So pre-training, we look at the 1 to 4 hours before exercise and recommend 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. This is a very, very broad recommendation, and truthfully, I've seen very few athletes that can consume 4 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate in one sitting beforehand. But you want to find the amount of carbohydrate that is going to sit well in the athlete's gut and the right timing for it as well. So figuring out where their sweet spot, for lack of a better term, is Is it best for them to eat 2 hours before? Do they have an iron gut and can eat an hour before? Working out what amount and what timing is going to work best for each athlete. And the closer they get to exercise, you want to start talking to the athlete about limiting the amount of fat, the amount of fiber, the amount of protein that they're taking in with this pre-training or event snack or meal, because those are going to slow the digestion and absorption process. And we don't want all that sitting in their gut as they begin exercise. We'll get into during training in a little bit, but between training bouts, so for those athletes that maybe do 2 trainings in a single day, which is not uncommon with this population, if they have less than 8 hours to recover between those 2 fueling sessions, we want them to consume 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per hour for the first 4 hours after that first training session, because that will help them replenish those glycogen stores before they start their next session, because we want them to have the fuel that they need in order to compete and train at their best in that second session as well. So during training and competition, Kelly already mentioned this, that depending on the duration, that is going to impact the amount of carbohydrate that we'd recommend, as well as the type of carbohydrate. So for those short training durations, less than 30 minutes, there really isn't a need for additional carbohydrate intake during. Even for sessions lasting 45 to 75 minutes, very, very small amounts are necessary, especially if the athlete has prepared well for them and is eating a carbohydrate-rich diet. They could potentially try doing a mouth rinse, which may provide a benefit for them, but they don't need to take in a dedicated amount of carbohydrate. When we start looking at longer durations though, 1 to 2 hours, we usually say up to 30 grams per hour for the athletes. Most carbohydrate forms are well tolerated. Kelly showed you the intestinal transporters. They all can absorb that amount in the hour-long period. Exercise of 2 to 3 hours up to about 60 grams, and at that point we really want them to focus on the rapidly oxidized sugars like glucose and sucrose. And then in the 2.5 to 3 hour plus period, that's when we'd start talking to the endurance athlete of about the up to 90 grams per hour. And we'd also discuss using that blend of glucose and fructose to maximize the intestinal transporters. Now, that doesn't mean that every athlete that's competing for 3+ hours needs to have up to 90 grams per hour. It's an option for them, something that we can maximize for them, but it's not always necessary. That's why it's important to work with your athletes, help them to log what they've done, what's working for them, what's not, and finding the amount of carbohydrate that is going to work the best for them. Now, form is the other thing that we have to consider. And really, as long as they're taking in that carbohydrate, the form is not as important. And again, this is something that I would encourage my athletes to test out in training, those long training runs, training rides. What form is going to sit the best in their gut and get them the carbohydrate they need without overloading and making them feel sick. So if they're an athlete who really can only tolerate fluids, sports drinks or water, a combination would be the focus for them. If there's those that get some fatigue from just getting it from a beverage, could look into other products. The intensity that the athlete is going to be going at might have some impact of what type of product they'd want to choose. If they're going at a slower pace where they're not going that high intensity, they may be able to get away with more solid type intake of carbohydrate. If they are going at a higher intensity or trying to, say, PR, they're going at a max pace, then staying away from those solids may work better for their gut. But again, each athlete is going to be different. That's why we would encourage them to try anything new in their training and not on race day specifically. So looking at these carbohydrate recommendations, I wanted to put together an example of how an athlete might consider breaking down the amount they'd take in, so that 30, 60, 90 grams. Looking at, for a triathlete, they're doing a 1-hour swim session. They may want to consider up to 30 grams of carbohydrate if they have the opportunity to actually take it in. If they're doing a 2-hour run, play with getting up to about that 60 grams. And then if they're going for a 4-hour ride, that's when they can start playing with the amounts for up to 90 grams and a blend of carbohydrate that will work well for them. So in summary, we know carbohydrate is well known to improve endurance. we do have limited endogenous stores. So after a point, especially if the athlete has not fueled well beforehand, they're going to need to take in some exogenous carbohydrate during the training session or during the race. Through diet, we can manipulate the endogenous stores. We can provide fuel and improve performance by taking carbohydrate in during training sessions. We can impact that carbohydrate absorption. And we can increase the rate of carbohydrate absorption to 90 grams per hour when we utilize those multiple transportable carbohydrates. And Kelly mentioned it briefly, and we'll talk about it more in the hydration session, but carbohydrates also have benefits on that fluid delivery and performance during exercise. So I will pass this back to Kelly now to go into hydration.
Okay, great. So now that we have discussed energy and how athletes get energy and use energy and the optimal sources of energy for each exercise duration and intensity, I'm going to move into hydration. Improper hydration, such as dehydration, can have many consequences if it's severe enough. The lack of body fluid can increase strain to your heart and cardiovascular system. It can also increase the need and use for glycogen. There's also ramifications to the metabolic and nervous system. And to make matters worse, dehydration can actually impair the body's ability to absorb and use the fluid that they're taking in. And of course, dehydration impairs thermal regulation and can put athletes at risk for heat-related illnesses. And then this is just showing what levels of hydration affect performance. And we know that, or it's generally stated that about 2% body fluid loss will impair your endurance performance. And the endurance studies are depicted by the bars with the gray hash lines. And this is a meta-analysis looking at the number of studies that show impairment based on these levels of dehydration. So impairment usually starts around the 2%, but there seems to be greater consistency across multiple studies with performance drops around the 2 and 3 and beyond. The 3 and 4% beyond. This is why we often hear 2% being the threshold that's highlighted, but why some athletes may be able to tolerate slightly greater losses and why practicing hydration is really important. Another form of improper hydration is over drinking or a situation that can occur that's called hyponatremia. And it usually happens because the plasma sodium drops, and the faster it drops and the longer it remains low, the greater the risk of health-related illnesses are for them. And typically this occurs because athletes are over-consuming dilute beverages, or they have sweating rates or sweat electrolyte concentrations that are very high. And that combination can cause them to have this issue where their blood sodium levels drop. And this is why it's really important for athletes to know how much fluid that they're losing and how much they should take in with a hydration plan. And the best way to determine hydration needs is to find out how much they're losing through their sweat. In this section, I'm going to explain what affects sweat and hydration and how to determine the sweating rate and hydration needs, and an example of how these can change. So there's two main things that affect hydration status is how much fluid you're losing through sweat and how much you're taking in. Temperature, humidity, environment, and training status all play a role into how much sweat fluid you lose and how fast you might dehydrate during exercise. And beverage temperature, sweetness, likability, and other preferences will influence how much fluid is consumed, as well as accessibility. To maintain hydration, specific components of the rehydration beverage impact various steps in the rehydration process. The water obviously replaces the sweat fluid that you're losing. The carbohydrate in the beverage can help transport water from the gut into the blood. And the sodium will not only help to distribute the fluid, but it'll help you retain the fluid so that you're not losing the fluid just through urine. Now that we know how much each of the components of hydration matters, let's discuss how to find out how much fluid you need during exercise. First, you need to find out how much fluid you're losing. And the simplest way is to test your sweating rate. There's no gold standard for sweating rate assessment in the field. The simplest way is just to look at body mass change from pre to post exercise, accounting for fluid and food intake and urine and stool loss. And usually we would do that, the urine and stool loss, with a body mass change from before and after. And then you'll need to know how long the training session is, meaning how long from pre-exercise body mass to post-exercise body mass. And this equation is here. And for those of you who aren't as into numbers or don't have athletes that are as into numbers as I am, there's many fluid loss calculators, and we have a convenient one on our website that'll give you all the information you need to know before you even set out to do this sweating rate test, and then allow you to actually just type in the numbers and it'll generate the sweating rate. Another thing you can have athletes do is, once you devise your hydration strategy, which I'll go into on the next slide, you can have them practice it on some of their longer training runs or rides, and have them do a pre-body mass and a post-body mass, and don't worry about anything in the middle, and just find out what their body mass change is. If they're gaining any weight, then you'll want them to scale back the fluid that they're taking in during exercise. And if they are losing more than about that 2%, then you'll want to redo some things to make sure that they can take in a little bit more. Now, some athletes I know won't ever be able to get to that 2%, depending on how long they're exercising, what their sweating rate is, and the temperatures. But you'll have to kind of customize that to the individual athlete. So here's a method for determining how much fluid you should take in. So now that we know how to figure out how much you lose, you'll take that information and apply some formulas to get your hydration strategy. So on the left side of the screen on our scratch pad, you can see that we figured out that this hypothetical athlete is going to lose 1.5 liters of sweat during the training session, based on the pre and post exercise body mass, and him consuming about 16 to 17 ounces of fluid. And on the right-hand side, you can see that his exercise duration was 90 minutes. So if we take the amount of fluid that he's losing through sweat over the duration, you get, conveniently, we get 1 liter per hour. And to make math easy, we decided that this athlete is training to run a 4-hour marathon, so that we know in the same exercise conditions, same intensity, same temperature, because you want to have your athletes do their hydration assessments or their hydration plans based on sweat losses in very similar conditions that they're going to be needing it for. If they just want a hydration strategy for a long training, then have them do it in one of the slightly shorter training sessions, but similar intensity, similar climate. And I'll show you a little bit more why that's important. So he's done that. He knows he's going to lose about 4 liters over 4 hours, because it's 1 liter per hour. So 4-hour marathon is 4 liters, or about 4 kilograms of body mass. And we don't want him to lose more than about 2% of body mass. And he, as you can see on the left-hand side, started at 70 kilograms, or about 155 pounds. So that is 1.4 or about 1.4 liters, or about 47 ounces that we want to take away from the amount of fluid that he's losing, because we want to give him that buffer of that 2%. So you subtract the 1.4 from the 4 liters, which gives us 2.6 liters that he needs to consume over the 4 hours, or about 650 milliliters every hour, which is 220 milliliters every 20 minutes. And in ounces, that is 135 ounces over 4 hours minus 47 ounces. That gets us to no more than 2% dehydration. And then we'll ask him to consume 88 ounces over the 4 hours, which is 22 ounces per hour, or roughly 7 to 8 ounces every 20 minutes. Now, we've done this study this longitudinal study we've been conducting over the last almost 20 years. And we've taken about 1,300 athletes that we've tested in the field across a variety of ages, body mass, multiple different environmental conditions. And you can see it's a very comprehensive group of athletes. And you can see that the sweating rates vary considerably, from very low to about 2.2 liters per hour to very, very high, 5.7. We had a couple of athletes, only a handful, but a couple of athletes that had sweating rates over 3 liters per hour that needed really very specific hydration recommendations. And this is just to show that no 2 athletes sweat alike, and we need to personalize hydration strategies to each athlete, meaning we need to understand the fluid that they're losing by sweat and the hydration strategies based on the last slide I showed you. Now, not only are no two athletes the same, but individual athletes have different sweat profiles based on their changes in exercise intensity and environments. So we took one athlete, we had him exercise at 2 different intensities in 3 different environments to give us 6 different sweat profiles to see if we needed to change his hydration strategy based on the conditions and the intensity that he was exercising in. So as you can see, we have on the far left is the cold climate, and then the middle is a moderate climate, and then the far right is a hot climate. All of them had low intensity and high intensity exercise. And you can see that as you just change exercise intensity, the amount of sweat fluid loss increases with higher exercise intensity. And then as you move into warmer, so we would call this a warm climate, the exercise or the sweat loss increases. And then again, as you get to hot climate, it increases again. So I want to show you a comparison of this. If we take this one athlete and take his 2 extremes, so his far left, low exercise intensity, cold environment, to his far right, hot environment, high exercise intensity. And we want to look at the differences. The low intensity, cool environment, he loses about 1 liter of sweat fluid. And the high intensity, hot environment, he loses about 2.2 liters of sweat fluid, which is a difference of 1.2 liters of sweat fluid over the course of that hour. Which if he's doing that 4-hour marathon, that's going to be a difference of 4.8 liters over the course of that event. Now, if I give you the hypothetical situation that he did his sweat rate test or his hydration strategy plan based on that low intensity, cool environment, and then traveled to his race where he increases intensity and it was a hot environment, he could be under drinking by about 4 liters if he sticks to his hydration plan. Or the opposite is true. If he does his sweat test in a hot environment with a higher intensity and then travels to somewhere that's cooler and does his testing, he could be over drinking by that same volume. Now, I know everyone doesn't have sweat sodium loss data, but for this athlete we did. So I want to show you how that trend stays the same. So as exercise intensity increases, so does sodium loss. As exercise, as the climate increases or gets warmer, sweat sodium losses increase. And I'm going to do the same thing on this spectrum. So the low, I'm going to compare the 2 extremes to show you that at the low intensity cool environment, this athlete loses about 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And in the high intensity hot environment, this athlete loses about almost 4,000 milligrams of sodium, which is a difference of about 3,000 milligrams of sodium in just 1 hour. And if he's doing that 4-hour marathon, that's going to be a total of 12,000 milligrams of sodium different that he could be under consuming or over consuming. It's just going to be a difference in the losses. Again, so it's very important if you have that information to do that test in as close to that environment as you can. And now to wrap up or end up the hydration section, I want to show you this study that separated 2 questions out. They wanted to look at, does fluid replacement affect performance, comparing Gatorade and an electrolyte water versus a carbohydrate gel or an electrolyte pill. And they found that the fluid those that had the fluid had a 6% faster time to complete a time trial. And then their second question was, does consuming carbohydrate affect performance? And they compared a salt pill versus an electrolyte water, a salt pill with an electrolyte water versus a carbohydrate gel or Gatorade, and found that those that had consumed carbohydrate had a 6% improvement in their time trial. And they postulated that those are not separate, but they're additive. So if you had the fluid and the carbohydrate, you could have a 12% faster time to complete the time trial from that study. So that just says that those 2 aspects are very important, especially when athletes are competing for a long time and when performance is important. To summarize hydration, I want to just reinforce again that practicing your hydration strategy is very important, and you should practice it in conditions that are as close to the condition that you want to use. So if you're using it for competition, try to get as close to the environment and the duration and the intensity that you can. You should expect to lose some weight during exercise. That's normal. However, you should try to drink enough fluid to stay within about 2% of your body weight in hot conditions and about 3% in cooler conditions. And again, we understand that that's not possible for everybody. So you'll have to customize the hydration strategies if athletes are losing a considerable amount. We don't ever recommend anyone overdrink. And again, if you know your strategy, that should be okay. And we recommend including sodium into the hydration beverages to improve palatability, stimulate drinking, and again, to retain the fluid so that they're not just losing that fluid through urine. And athletes that are losing high amounts of sodium, if you know that, if they're losing more than about 3 grams in their training session or their competition, should recommend that they take in additional sodium, and those athletes that are exercising for more than about 2 hours. This would also apply to those athletes that you know have salt residue on their skin or clothing, even when exercising in moderate intensity. And then they should focus on their daily fluid intake as well. So they should drink gradually throughout the day and avoid drinking too much too quickly, both throughout the day and during their competition. That's why we recommended having that athlete consume smaller amounts of fluid every 20 minutes versus a large bolus in the 1 hour time point. Now that we've finished hydration, I'm going to pass it back over to Lisa to discuss structure.
All right, so now we're getting into the space that we start discussing protein. Now, carbohydrate and rehydrating after a training session are still very, very important, especially when the athlete intends to compete again same day, just for overall recovery. But here we're actually going to talk about the structure and the process of turnover and balancing that muscle protein synthesis with breakdown. So exercise naturally increases that muscle protein synthesis process, but we need to deliver the amino acids from food in order to aid this process, because we may have a small repository of amino acids in the body, but we don't store excess protein. It's used for different functions in the body. It's used for your muscles, but again, it's not stored as something we can just pull from to rebuild muscle tissue or that support muscle protein synthesis. So actually taking in protein as soon as they can post-training is going to be really important to supporting this muscle protein synthesis process and maximizing when the body is naturally in a more anabolic state and wanting to repair those tissues. So some criteria to look for in protein, specifically for the post-exercise meal or snack, is look for a protein that's complete, meaning it has all the essential amino acids that the body cannot make on its own, one that is going to be rapidly digested and absorbed, and also rich in the branched chain amino acid leucine. So whey and milk fit this criteria the best overall. That doesn't mean that other complete sources such as soy are bad. It just means that we've, through research, have seen that whey and milk are the best sources for stimulating muscle protein synthesis and hitting that leucine threshold that athletes need to essentially trigger or ignite the muscle protein synthesis process. So leucine does play a special role here. It's a building block in the muscle tissues, and it's also that signal to start the recovery and repair process. So looking at actual amounts, the way we usually discuss it is that 20 grams is right for most athletes, but looking at some dose response studies that have been done, we've teased out at around 0.25 up to 0.3 grams per kilogram of protein is appropriate for athletes. So this comes into play when we start looking at athletes that are of different body sizes. So the example I have here is an athlete who's 210 pounds versus an athlete who's 135. You can see 15 to 24 grams of protein. It's a less than a 10 gram split. So if the athlete who needs 24 grams only takes in 20, I mean, he's probably okay, especially if he's going to be eating another meal within an hour. But if you do work with an athlete who is extremely small or on the heavier side, you may want to look into tailoring their post-protein a little bit more closely. And then throughout the rest of the day, hitting this rough target of 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram every 3 to 4 hours will help to continue that recovery process and help the athlete prepare for their next training session. So what else? I'm not going to go super in depth into supplements that these athletes could take, but I wanted to highlight some that may be of more interest to the endurance community. Energy, hydration, and structure are the foundation of sports nutrition. And if the athlete is eating a well-rounded diet and has a good fuel and hydration strategy, they will likely be doing and performing fairly well. But these are a few that may have some evidence to support their use. Caffeine is one. This one has a lot of actually strong support behind it, can reduce perceptions of fatigue and allow exercise to be sustained at the optimal intensity or output that the athlete is looking for longer. Sodium bicarbonate. This one, it improves performance in events that would otherwise be limited by changes in the acid-base balance, more with the anaerobic type exercise, so high intensity events of 1 to 7 minutes. So looking if they're doing repeated high intensity sprints, or they're having that capacity for that high intensity sprint during an endurance training session. This one may come along with some side effects that athletes may not be huge fans of. This is especially one that if an athlete wants to try and use sodium bicarbonate, they should use it in their training first to see how they respond to it. Beta-alanine may improve performance in events that would otherwise be, again, limited by that acid-base balance. It's another one that's more targeted to those high-intensity activities, those things, training sessions or sprints that may last 60 to 240 roughly seconds. It may enhance training capacity, but again, this is another one that with the different dosages, there may be some side effects that athletes may find more bothersome than helpful. Nitrates, this is one that there has been a lot more literature in the last few years on it, but may improve exercise tolerance and economy and improve performance in endurance exercise, specifically in non-elite athletes, those that aren't training as they're at that elite level. And that's an important thing to note when you're discussing nitrates, that most of the promising literature has been shown in the non-elite level. And then vitamin D and omega-3, these are two that there's a lot of new literature coming out that seems really promising around inflammation and the recovery process with muscle protein synthesis. Many athletes tend to be deficient. So that is something that if the athlete can get some type of blood work and omega-3 index, testing their vitamin D status, it might be worth looking into, and especially if they're deficient, having that type of supplementation may provide them with an additional benefit. So I want to close up today with a case study. So this is John. He's an elite level competitive age group triathlete. And in working with him, we've broken down what his daily nutrition needs are based on his training status and what he's doing throughout the week. So looking at his low days or rest days versus his really high intensity training days. And we've averaged his calories between around 3,500 to 4,600 calories per day. And carbohydrate, because he is doing longer duration triathlons, excuse me, I've put him at a higher end of the carbohydrate range, so 8 to 10 grams per kilogram. And then protein, there's a wide range that's actually recommended in the position stand, 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram. So working with him on the amount that feels comfortable for him, that he can tolerate in a day, as long as he's hitting that minimum, and he should be okay, but he may need to take in a little bit more just because his calorie needs are so high. So he may need to go to the higher end of that spectrum. And then fat, there isn't a specific gram per kilogram recommendation here, but I do want to make sure he's not going below that 20% of his calories from fat, just to support his overall needs and his health. So Kelly talked about looking at sweat sodium concentrations in different levels. What I've pulled out here is in kind of moderate humidity, 75-degree weather at a high intensity. So what his losses are here. So he was looking at close to his race pace when we did these. And you'll see with swimming, that's an estimate because some athletes may swallow some water as they're racing, so you can't necessarily get an exact amount or an exact sweat rate here. But we have an estimate when he's swimming in 78-degree water. Now, one of the reasons that John is coming in and wanting to do some more consultations is because he's had a lot of GI issues in the past in his races, sometimes in training, more often in races. He hasn't necessarily set a specific plan in the past. So what we're going to talk about first is actually training his gut. So looking at, can we increase the upregulation of those intestinal transporters? Can we work with his stomach and his gut to improve fluid absorption and not getting that sloshy gut? Because your stomach is a muscle. It is something that you can gradually train. There isn't necessarily a set strategy that's been presented in the literature to be successful, but with slow increases and consistent increases throughout training, we can actually help the athlete tolerate that fluid, that carbohydrate better during exercise and not have them either getting that sloshy gut or be running to the porta potties. So what I did with him is put together a plan based on one of his training days and breaking down kind of the target amounts of carbohydrate and fluid that I'd want him to hit, and then some food options to actually meet that. So you're not going to see actual amounts in the food options section. That would be a little bit too granular here, but these are all foods that would provide enough to meet those gram targets. So looking at breakfast, he swims at 6:30. We know he has a sensitive gut, so we're targeting about an hour and a half before that swim session. He didn't want to wake up any earlier than that, so that's about as far out as we went. So to start, we went with a gram per kilogram of carbohydrate in that hour and a half before he would actually hit the pool. And then because he had been sleeping overnight, 3 to 5 mils per kilogram of fluid just to help get some fluid inside him. Now, he likes the idea of caffeine, so fine with having coffee there. That will provide some of that fluid depending on the amount he drinks. And then just having a carbohydrate-rich small meal with that toast, the strawberries, banana, all that. And then in his, during the swim session, he's at the pool for this one. So I told him fluid ad lib, if you want to come to the edge and have a drink, that's fine. Reality in the open water swim, he's probably not going to do that. So it's up to him how he wants to handle that in his training. Post swim, because he is going to have a second training session that day, we started with that 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate and then added in that protein there based on his body weight of about 170 pounds. We targeted 19 to 23 grams of protein. So again, he's around that 20 gram mark. He didn't want to make eggs or have sausage or anything like that. So working with him is creating that oatmeal, adding some healthy antioxidants, some seeds, and then he added whey isolate protein powder to his oatmeal to get that protein in. A small snack to, again, put some protein in his body, get some of that carbohydrate back in, and then allowing him to drink fluid ad lib at this point. So working with him, he didn't have a huge fluid losses in that swim session. So letting him drink throughout the day, he's monitoring his urine color. So as long as it's coming out that light like lemonade, we told him it doesn't need to be clear by any means. He shouldn't be going to the bathroom every 30 minutes because he's drinking so much, but looking to try and target that light like lemonade color and having used the restroom on a regular basis, but not one that hinders any work and ability to do things throughout the day. So in that snack, he had a fuel bar that had some protein in it, had some milk, and then has been drinking water since his post-swim meal throughout his snack. For lunch, again, we're spacing that carbohydrate throughout the day to help him meet his overall needs. So something easy, if he likes to eat out, going and getting a burrito bowl. Now, for those of you that may go to a common restaurant that makes burrito bowls, if you eat the entire bowl, it's going to be way beyond those carbohydrate and protein targets that I set for him. Depending on if he's going to be training again, what he's going to do with the rest of his meals, that may be okay. But he knows he's going to be training again in 2 hours. So he eats about half the bowl to meet those needs and continues to drink his fluids. It's not advancing. Okay. So at 2:30, he goes for a 90-minute run. And if you remember back to the carbohydrate recommendations, for a 90-minute run, you're not going to be recommending that 90 grams per hour. However, because he has had a history of GI issues, and this was going to be a higher intensity run, I had him work on consuming 60 to 80 grams at this point, going by how his gut was feeling as he went. So you can use a combination of a sports drink and an energy gel and water at this point to meet his fluid and carbohydrate needs. So this is an example. If you know what the athlete is going to be doing, even if it's not the right duration, doing a higher intensity run that's closer to race pace, you can take in a little bit more carbohydrate at this point. Then post-run dinner snack, this is focusing on getting the muscle recovery, getting enough carbohydrate in. That nighttime snack, we are targeting a little bit more protein just before he goes into that overnight fast to help support muscle recovery as he continues. All right, so race day, really what he's doing is trying to stay consistent with what he did in training. So having his pre-swim meal, a small amount of carbohydrate before he gets in the water, but sticking with things that are familiar and what he did with his training plan. Same in the transitions, when he's on the bike, when he's on the run, he's using the strategy that we laid out in his training and that he did during his high intensity training runs. Having a gel available to him, depending on how his gut is feeling, he may or may not take it to get up to that 90 grams per hour. He doesn't necessarily have to have it. Again, just because they're going for 4+ hours doesn't necessarily mean they have to do 90 grams per hour. It's working with their gut and what they can tolerate. Then afterwards, rehydrate, but have that celebratory meal. The athlete just finished a race. As long as they're getting the carbohydrate and protein they need, they can go out and enjoy whatever their gut can tolerate at that moment. So closing, so we have some time for question. Experiment and adapt. And in training, have the athlete keep a log, especially if they've had issues with GI issues in the past or dehydration, side effects of dehydration. Note the environmental conditions. Have them take notes of how they feel, comments about the run. That's going to help them set their plan for actual race day. Potentially do some B or C level races for them, not their final pitch, looking what can they do to fine tune that race plan. And then include nutrition in that race and event report. So some things you may have noticed that we didn't cover, looking at overall diet, the low carbohydrate, high fat, talking about carbohydrate loading. Those could be presentations all on their own. Train low in carbohydrate periodization, super specific hydration strategies that athletes can follow, and then that deeper dive into supplements, the when, how much, all of that. Those are all topics that deserve much more time than the 5 minutes we could dedicate to them. So now I think we will open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and we do have just a few minutes to take a few questions. So one of the first questions that came in was, can you talk about the physiological mechanism for the effect of rinsing the mouth with carbohydrate?
Sure. It's not completely clear, but there seems to be some receptors in the mouth or in the actual back of the throat that can send signals to the brain to just make them give them triggers that make them feel better. So it just makes them feel like the exertion is easier. So it's not actually fueling them, obviously, because if they spit it out, it is not actually any fuel getting into their stomach or into their blood, but it's the receptors that are in the mouth that are sending signals to the brain to give them a perception of their comfort.
Okay, and how do carbohydrate recommendations differ between adult athletes and young athletes or youth athletes?
So there's a lot less literature in the youth population just because getting studies approved in people under 18 is difficult. So don't necessarily have an exact answer for that, but depending on the level that let's look at high school specifically, that athlete is playing at, you may want to adjust their needs a little bit more. If someone is playing, let's use like a select sport, so beyond their high school, or they're traveling all summer doing whatever their sport is, their needs will likely be higher than the average high school athlete. But you're also talking about adding in growth and maturity and the stage in the maturation cycle that they're at. So they're going to vary a little bit just based on where that athlete is. Same thing with protein. I mean, if you have a 15-year-old that hasn't hit the next stage in maturation, no matter how much they're going to eat, they're not going to put on that muscle mass. So that's something that you would need to tailor based on where that specific athlete is. So I don't have a very exact answer for you. It would be more of a case by case, what the athlete's doing and where they are in terms of maturity.
Great, thanks. Another question is, what are some strategies that you might recommend for changing race day strategy if the weather conditions are not what the athlete was expecting?
So that's where it goes back to what Kelly was talking about, looking at intensity level as well as weather conditions. And I mean, doing those body weight changes during your training is something free that each athlete can do, and having that log would be really important for them. I mean, look at the weather in Boston in the last 10 years. We've gone from extremely, extremely hot races to really cold and wet. I mean, that's a huge spectrum that those athletes could be racing in. So understanding in cooler weather or wet weather what their body is going to do versus those hot conditions will help them set their strategy on race day and actually feel prepared going out on the course versus just guessing as they go.
And we actually recommend that athletes do a similar thing that we did with that athlete and have at least a couple of sweat or hydration strategies for a low and a high intensity exercise in each of the different climates, so that they know, even if they could have something happen during the race where they have to slow down, and then you don't want them sticking with the initial hydration plan where they would be burning extra amounts of fuel and losing extra sweat. So you'd want them to be able to kind of be fluid with it even during a race. So having understanding how the sweat changes. Some people have quite dramatic changes in their sweat losses and how much they burn of carbohydrate from lower intensity exercise or from cooler to hot environments. Some have minor. So your athlete might have be one of those people that just has minor changes and the climate won't affect them that much. But you might have one of the athletes that has quite large variance in their sweat profiles, and it would be very important for them to understand how their losses change.
Great. I think we're going to take one more question. So what do you recommend for individuals who can't, consume dairy or milk, or they have problems with the whey-gluten relationship?
Yeah, so I mean, I pointed out that the literature supports using, in terms of maximizing muscle recovery, using whey and milk. That doesn't mean that taking in soy or an alternative source of protein, as long as it's complete and they're taking it in regularly, they will still have a benefit. It just may not be maximizing it to the same extent. That's one area of research that'll be really interesting to see more on, is using blends of incomplete proteins to see, putting them together to make a complete protein and having enough leucine. What would the response be then? So it doesn't mean all hope is lost if you can't have dairy, but taking in some type of protein is still going to have some benefit for them. And consuming protein on a regular basis throughout the day, not in large bolus doses.
Okay, thank you. That's going to wrap up the time that we have for Q&A today. But as a reminder to the attendees, if you had a question that went unanswered, we are going to take additional questions and post them later as a blog on the ACSM website. So please visit to learn more. And with that, we're going to thank everyone for attending. Thank you to today's presenters, Lisa Heaton and Kelly Barnes, and the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for supporting today's webinar. As a final reminder, an email with a link to your CEC, along with a recorded version of the webinar, will be sent within the next 1 to 2 days. There's no need to contact ACSM. Within that email, there will also be a short survey, and we'd appreciate your feedback on today's session. Have a great afternoon, and this concludes today's webinar.